see. More to that story later, maybe, perhaps.
President Zedillo, do you have a sense
well,
of how it addresses
I think I have a general comment. I met President Clinton when he had already been president for 2 years, at the time that I was elected. But from day one that we met, I had the idea that he did have a vision. And he did have a vision in which diplomacy, engagement, respect to others, active decisions to try to solve problems was in the national interest of the United States, which is, I think, the right way to think about this. You do diplomacy, you do international cooperation, not because you want to do international philanthropy. Of course, every president in the world has to be absolutely convinced that his or her country is first. That's almost stupid to say otherwise. I mean, to say it, because it's so obvious. But Bill Clinton will practice that, and will practice that with the instruments that the United States had led to create for the international community. So I agree with Madeleine that he did have a vision, and that vision, working with the multilateral institutions and using diplomacy was extremely important, and working with the neighbors. I hope I can get into details later on.
Well, I'd like to get into some actual examples of him implementing that vision, and maybe we can start with the end of the Cold War, NATO enlargement. One of the interesting things about the end of the Cold War that it did create the possibility of a bipartisan moment in U.S. foreign policy. I wonder if you can give us some sense of how Clinton reacted to that, how he fostered bipartisanship, and how he thought through the strategy of American engagement to ensure an effective Russian integration into the broader international system, how he moved towards a bipartisan approach to that and worked with our allies to effectively enlarge NATO. Maybe we can start with Strom Talbot with that.
Yes. He was quite convinced early on that it was important to expand and deepen international institutions, as Ernesto just said. And there was controversy over whether NATO had done its thing and should kind of go into history with a good record of not getting us into World War III. President Clinton didn't see it that way. Remember that there was a horrific war in the Balkans, which was a warning that just because Russia and the other post-Soviet states were no longer the evil empire, and the Warsaw Pact was no longer the evil empire, there was still a role for NATO. And one of the things that he did from the very beginning, and Madeleine can tell you more about this, was that he was absolutely committed to the proposition that now that Russia was no longer the evil empire, it should be part of a new world order, and it would have to have hard power and soft power, and NATO was the obvious and most capable source of hard power. And there was one other point he came to talk to a number of us about, and that was if we did not enlarge NATO, countries like the one that Madam Secretary knows so well, a country that also doesn't exist in its current name, and that was Czechoslovakia. If those countries that were caught between the old Soviet Union and NATO Europe and the European Union, and they didn't have a
a commitment from the United States and from NATO to help them as they go forward, a lot of bad things would happen there. And he kept pointing to Yugoslavia as kind of a lesson that we had to learn.
Well, I think that what was very interesting is that he had, in fact, studied how NATO had been, well, what happened after the end of World War II when half of Europe was, against its will, put behind the Iron Curtain, and then the creation of NATO and all the various aspects. So he did not come into this kind of not knowing any of the background. What I think is interesting is that he also appreciated something that a lot of people haven't thought of, which is that at the end of the Cold War, the U.S. was asked to do something that hasn't been done before, which is how to devolve the power of your major adversary without a land war. And so the question was how to bring Russia into the system. And what I found very interesting at the time was, and Strobe actually was in charge of our relationship with Russia then, and I was up in New York, but basically it was building on what President Bush had done in terms of the reunification of Germany, and then looking at what steps had to be taken to respect Russia and bring it into a system. And so the whole issue of expansion of NATO began in a very step-by-step process with something called the Partnership for Peace, where various countries that had been either part of NATO or later part of what had been the Soviet Union could begin to see how the system worked and play a role in cooperative action. And I now urge people there have been some memos that have been declassified by the Clinton Library, which describe how President Clinton was talking to President Yeltsin at the time about how to do all this in a very staged approach and in a way that Russia would be respected and become part of something and began to have Russia-NATO dialogue. So I admire, first of all, the goal of it, but then also the carefulness with which President Clinton directed that we all take steps to do this in some way that was organized, and that, in fact, respected what was going on in Russia. And these memos are so worth reading because it's where President Clinton is talking to President Yeltsin, and they recognize each other's politics in addition to recognizing the issue that they were dealing with.
Just one point, because what Madeline just said brings back a very vivid memory. The Russians hated the idea of NATO bombing Serbia. But President Yeltsin, because of his close tie with President Clinton, was absolutely essential in getting the Serbian genocidal dictator Milosevic out of office, and thereby actually made it possible for us to bring an end to the Balkan Wars without having to go into a land war. And that, I think, was a huge accomplishment and a very heroic one on Yeltsin's part, and it was based on his relationship with President Clinton.
We're going to talk in a little bit about him as an individual and how he built relationships, because I'd like to go further into that. But first, maybe if I can ask President Zedillo to talk about his vision towards Latin America and Mexico and the critical bipartisan relationship there and how he moved that forward.
Well, I think I have to start, obviously, with the case of my country, where I think President Clinton gave repeated proofs of his vision that a good relationship with Mexico was very important for the interest of the United States. I think the first test was against what he had hinted or sometimes openly said during his campaign. He became a champion of NAFTA, right? You remember NAFTA was really not rejected by Congress because it was fast-tracked at the beginning of the Clinton administration. And he knew that he will pay a high political cost for being so proactive in his own party, and that also the other major party will, punish him for that. And yet he went ahead, and NAFTA was approved. So that was first test. Second big test was the fact that in late 1994, just as I was becoming president of Mexico, my country faced an incredibly difficult financial crisis, practically unprecedented in modern Mexican history. And this was only a few days into my administration. And I called President Clinton and said, bad news, the country is literally bankrupt. I wouldn't call you except that I have two powerful reasons. One, I need the support not only of the IMF, which we already had a commitment because we had put in place immediately a very strong stabilization and reform program, but this situation is so bad that we need to put together more resources. And the second reason why I called you is because, in my view, if we don't control this situation, it will not be only a Mexican crisis. It will be more systemic. Certainly, it will affect the rest of Latin America. And as we saw in '82, with the debt crisis, the beginning of the debt crisis, this could be systemic to the entire international financial system. He was a little bit surprised. He said, I didn't know things were so bad. He said, let me talk to Bob and Larry, And then he called me back 2 days later, and he says, in that accent you were commenting, Bob and Larry say that you may be right. I said, yes, of course I'm right. I have a PhD in economics. You only have a law degree. No, I'm just kidding. And,
at Yale.
Right, at the same university. Right? But anyways, he, again, tried to go one way through Congress. He worked with the bipartisan leadership. Once I was in a conference call with the 4 leaders from the 2 parties. But then the thing could not get through Congress. And at the end, I think he did a great act of statesmanship. He used an old facility that existed since the 1930s in the Treasury to lend Mexico the money. And of course, this was not popular because if NAFTA wasn't popular, well, least of all to lend money to Mexico. And the argument he used over and over again said, this is in the interest of my country. And he had this very nice way to explain things. I told the leaders that if your neighbor's house is burning, you better help your neighbor because otherwise your house can also get a fire. Very, very graphic, very simple arguments. At the end of the day, could not go through Congress, but we got the resources. And he was always very confident that it will be all right. And it was very all right because I paid him in advance, 3 years in advance. And we always make jokes about this. He said, how did you do that? He said, you were charging me a too high interest rate to prevent moral hazard, and at the end, I think it was a good story of cooperation, an act of statesmanship that he had.
So all you're